War of the Fourth Coalition and Tilsit. After Austerlitz, Napoleon increased his political power in Europe. In 1806, he deposed the Bourbon king of Naples and installed his elder brother, Joseph, on the throne. He then made his younger brother, Louis, king of Holland. He also established the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German states intended to serve as a buffer zone between France and Central Europe, which marked the end of the Holy Roman Empire. Napoleon's growing influence in Germany threatened Prussia's status as a great power. In response, Frederick William III decided on war with France. Prussia and Russia signed a new military alliance, creating the Fourth Coalition against France. However, Prussia made a strategic blunder by declaring war while French troops were still in southern Germany and months before sufficient Russian troops could arrive. Napoleon invaded Prussia with 180,000 troops, rapidly marching on the right bank of the river Saale. Upon learning the whereabouts of the Prussian army, the French swung westwards, cutting the Prussians off from Berlin and the approaching Russians. At the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt on October 14th, the French convincingly defeated the Prussians and inflicted heavy casualties. With several major commanders incapacitated, the Prussian king struggled to effectively command the army, which quickly disintegrated. In the following month, the French captured 140,000 soldiers and over 2,000 cannons. Despite their overwhelming defeat, the Prussians refused to negotiate with the French until the Russians could enter the fight. Following his triumph, Napoleon imposed the first elements of the Continental system through the Berlin Decree issued in November 1806, which prohibited European nations from trading with Britain. In the next few months, Napoleon marched against the advancing Russian armies through Poland and fought a bloody stalemate at the Battle of Eylau in February 1807. After a period of rest and consolidation on both sides, the war restarted in June with an initial struggle at Heilsberg that proved indecisive. On June 14th, Napoleon obtained an overwhelming victory over the Russians at the Battle of Friedland, wiping out about 30% of the Russian army. The scale of their defeat convinced the Russians to make peace with the French. The two emperors began peace negotiations on June 25th at the town of Tilsit, meeting on a raft floating in the middle of the river Niemen. Napoleon offered Alexander relatively lenient terms, demanding that Russia join the Continental system, withdraw its forces from Wallachia and Moldavia, and hand over the Ionian Islands to France. In contrast, Prussia was treated harshly, losing half its territory and population and undergoing a 2-year occupation costing about 1.4 billion francs. From former Prussian territory, Napoleon created the Kingdom of Westphalia, ruled by his younger brother Jerome, and the Duchy of Warsaw. Prussia's humiliating treatment at Tilsit caused lasting resentment against France. The treaty was also unpopular in Russia, putting pressure on Alexander to end the alliance with France. Nevertheless, the Treaties of Tilsit gave Napoleon a respite from war and allowed him to return to France, which he had not seen in over 300 days. Peninsular War and Air Fort. After Tilsit, Napoleon turned his attention to Portugal, which was reluctant to strictly enforce the blockade against its traditional ally, Britain. On October 17, 1807, 24,000 French troops under General Junot crossed the Pyrenees with Spanish consent and headed towards Portugal to enforce the blockade. Junot occupied Lisbon in November, but the Portuguese royal family had already fled to Brazil with the Portuguese fleet. In March 1808, a palace coup led to the abdication of the Spanish King Carlos IV in favor of his son Fernando VII. The following month, Napoleon summoned Carlos and Fernando to Bayonne where, in May, he forced them both to relinquish their claims to the Spanish throne. Napoleon then made his brother Joseph King of Spain. By then, there were 120,000 French troops garrisoned in the peninsula and widespread Spanish opposition to the occupation and the overthrow of the Spanish Bourbons. On May 2nd, an uprising against the French broke out in Madrid and spread throughout Spain in the following weeks. In the face of brutal French repression, the uprising developed into a sustained conflict. In July, Joseph traveled to Madrid, where he was proclaimed King of Spain on the 24th. However, following news of a French defeat by regular Spanish forces at the Battle of Balen, Joseph fled Madrid several days later. The following month, a British force landed in Portugal and, on the 21st, they defeated the French at Vimeiro. Under the Convention of Sintra, the French evacuated Portugal. The defeats at Balen and Vimeiro convinced Napoleon that he had to take command of the Iberian campaign. Before leaving for Spain, he attempted to strengthen the alliance with Russia and obtain a commitment from Alexander that Russia would declare war on Austria if she attacked France. At the Congress of Erfurt in October 1808, Napoleon and Alexander reached an agreement that recognized the Russian conquest of Finland and called upon Britain to cease its war against France. However, Alexander failed to provide a firm commitment to make war with Austria. On November 6, Napoleon was in Vitoria and took command of 240,000 French troops. After a series of victories over Anglo-Spanish forces, Madrid was retaken on December 4. Napoleon then pursued the retreating British forces, who were eventually evacuated at Corunna in January 1809. Napoleon left for France on January 17, leaving Joseph in command. Napoleon never returned to Spain after the 1808 campaign. In April, the British sent another army to the peninsula under Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. British, Portuguese, and Spanish regular forces engaged the French in a protracted series of conflicts. Meanwhile, a brutal guerrilla war engulfed much of the Spanish countryside, a conflict in which atrocities were committed by both sides. Napoleon later called the Peninsular Campaign the unlucky war that ruined me. It tied up some 300,000 French troops from 1808 to 1812. By 1814, the French had been driven from the peninsula, with over 150,000 casualties in the campaign.